Okay, thanks, Torsten. That's on, I hope. Hopefully I can move the slides. Yes, I can. Okay. So I wanted to give you a brief description of these distance-based charges, precisely as Torsten says, is because if they're not unique, they're certainly unusual. There seem to be very few such systems in place. So in both countries, these systems apply to all kilometres travelled by the relevant vehicles, but they apply only to a pretty small subset of the light vehicle market in each case. They differ in one important respect in that New Zealand has a very long established system, so perhaps there might be more to be learned from that simply because it's been in place for a long time. Conversely, there are several Australian systems. They've all been announced very recently. Only one of them is in fact in place at the moment, although there are legislated start dates for the remaining ones. So to start with New Zealand's charge, this is called a road user charge. It's been in place since 1978, and it applies to all vehicles that use fuels that are not taxed at source, is the terminology that's used. In practice, what that effectively means is diesel vehicles, because petrol is subject to taxation, liquid gas fuels are subject to taxation, but diesel fuel has not been and still isn't. The focus of this charge was originally on recovering the road damage costs from heavy vehicles. It was introduced at a time at which diesel cars were pretty much unknown on New Zealand roads. And interestingly, over that 45 years since the charge has been introduced, despite its existence, there's been a fairly steady growth in the proportion of the light vehicle fleet that's accounted for by diesel cars. It got to about 12% in 2000, and it's up around 20% now. So it seems that the charge hasn't been an undue disincentive to the adoption of diesels, interestingly. Electric vehicles are also notionally included because, again, there is no taxation of electricity used as a vehicle fuel at the source, as they say. But at present, EVs enjoy an exemption which is currently due to last until early 2024. And that represents an extension on the previous end date, which was 2021. So there still seems to be concern about avoiding creating disincentives to the take-up of EVs, notwithstanding that experience of the growth of diesel cars in the presence of the tax. I should say New Zealand, like Australia, has a pretty low level of take-up of EVs in its vehicle fleet at the moment. So for HGVs, the charges, there are several categories based on weight and on axle numbers and therefore on loads. But for light vehicles, it's a single distance-based charge. 76 until a recent discount offered because of the energy crisis, it was 76 New Zealand dollars per 1,000 kilometres, which is about 46 euros. And users are required to buy licenses in 1,000-kilometre blocks. They get a little sticker, which they're required to put on the windscreen. And the charges, both in terms of this road user charge and in terms of vehicle taxation, are set at levels that are intended to achieve the goal of recovering the total cost of road infrastructure expenditure. And so there's a hypothecation of the revenue from the road user charge, as well as vehicle registration charges and some others, and the fuel tax, all going into the National Land Transport Fund, out of which that infrastructure is paid for. The road user charge is set at a level that's supposed to achieve broad parity with the fuel tax in terms of the tax paid per kilometre travelled. So there's a deliberate intent to avoid creating an incentive toward using one or the other kind of fuel. So to move to the Australian system, the part of the fleet to which it applies is zero and low emissions vehicles. So it's only battery and plug-in, battery electric vehicles and plug-in hybrids that are affected. And the stated rationale is basically the same as in New Zealand. It is to tax users of untaxed fuels. It is a very recent policy, as I said. 4 of the 8 subnational governments in Australia have announced that they're going down this path. The first 2 of them did so in 2020, and 2 others have followed in 2021 and 2022. Now, of those 4, only 1 actually has the charge in place at the moment. That's my home jurisdiction of Victoria, and the charge commenced in July 2021. The others have all nominated 2027 as being the date at which they will implement their charges, but they have all set out in legislation the design of the charges. So it's known what they're going to look like when they come into effect, but we've got this 5-year delay from the present. There's a very high level of commonality in the charges between the 4 jurisdictions. Essentially, it's a single charge of 2.5 Australian cents per kilometre for battery electric vehicles, 2 cents a kilometre for plug-in hybrids. And that's to be implemented with the Consumer Price Index. There is a low-tech implementation model, which is basically integrated with the vehicle registration system. So you're required to send a photograph of your odometer whenever you renew the registration of your vehicle, and on purchase and sale of the vehicle as well. There's an invoice issued by the registration authority, and you pay the invoice through their dedicated app. The expected revenue from the charges at the level that they've currently been set is, unlike the New Zealand case where there's an attempt at equality, here it's expected to be a little bit more than half of what you would pay on a per kilometre basis if you're paying fuel excise for an average vehicle. Although critics have pointed out that if you're driving a very fuel efficient car like a traditional hybrid, you could end up paying less than you do if you're paying this charge as a battery electric vehicle driver. There was very strong initial opposition to the charge. When Victoria announced its proposals, there was an open letter from about 25 signatories, which are industry groups and manufacturers and others, who described it memorably as the world's worst EV policy. And so it was kind of surprising in that regard that it was followed by, a pretty rapid adoption of similar policies in 3 other jurisdictions. So that, half our jurisdictions, representing maybe 3/4 of the Australian population, have adopted this policy despite that initial blowback. So in the case of New South Wales, this is the other very large state in Australia, apart from Victoria, by population size. The minister came out and was very critical of the Victorian charge, and 10 months later turned around and announced exactly the same charge for New South Wales. Some other policy shifts, again, within this very short period of time. South Australia originally proposed to start its charge in 2021, along with Victoria, but the opposition that it found when it did public consultation, and also tried to get this through a parliament where the government didn't have a majority in both houses, meant that the compromise was they went for a 2027 introduction. Interestingly enough, they then had an election. There was a change of government. It wasn't really anything to do with this charge, but there was a change of government, and the new government has subsequently announced that it is actually going to repeal the charge. So I guess the acceptability question is there's still a question mark over that in the Australian context. So I mentioned earlier, there is a very low EV take-up in Australia. And I think there was a sense that the opposition to this charge was the implementation of the charge was going to be pretty limited as a result, because the number of people who would actually be paying it in the short term was obviously fairly small. Possibly there was also a sense that drivers of conventional cars might be supportive because they saw it as being a good thing to stop EV drivers from free riding by not paying any fuel tax and getting their road use for free. But I think the other dynamic that was at play there was that there was a consciousness that there's very little in the way of positive incentives from Australian governments to adopt EVs. And of course, that's got a lot to do with the fact that we don't have very many in the fleet. Very long distances and range anxiety is obviously also another factor, but there's certainly been a distinct absence of incentives. So this charge was seen as providing a strong disincentive in that sort of broader context. And that move of the other three states to delay introduction seems to have been their approach to trying to avoid this issue of, well, we're disincentivizing EV take-up at just the wrong time when it's becoming important. What they also did was, at around about the same time these policies were announced, they announced for the first time packages of EV incentives. And these included things like purchase price rebates, committing to co-funding the adoption of charging infrastructure. There were registration fee reductions and so forth. But if you look at the overall size of the incentives, they were pretty small. Victoria has a population about the same as Denmark's, and the total budgeted cost of what it's announced so far is 100 million Australian dollars, which is about 65 million euros. So clearly not very huge. The other part of the context is that within about the same period, the other four subnational governments that weren't going ahead with these charging systems also announced their own policies of support for EV adoption. They were pretty similar in the way that they are designed. A little bit difficult to compare them in terms of size because not all of them announced budgetary costs, but it appears that they're broadly of the same scale. So we can't say that the jurisdictions that are going ahead with the fees are doing more to sort of counter the balance. It appears rather that there was a broader political dynamic at play, that it really was about time Australian governments did something to encourage transport decarbonisation. I don't know that you can read the tweet necessarily there. This is from someone who's an academic and a bit of an EV activist, but he tweets that he just returned from a road trip up to Queensland from Victoria in his Tesla. He'd paid a total of $84 for the electricity that his car had used in that period, partly because he got lots of free charging from available chargers at his destinations. But he paid $131 in the distance-based charge to the Victorian government. And he objected to that particularly because only 12% of the kilometres he drove were within Victoria and on Victorian roads. So there is this issue that the tax looms large in relation to the cost of fuel, and the state-based nature of the tax seems to be a bit of an issue. And there's this question of whether it's unfair that I'm paying Victoria for driving on New South Wales and Queensland's roads. Interestingly enough, whereas the states previously levied fuel tax in Australia, about 25 years ago, that was challenged constitutionally. The High Court decided that fuel tax was an excise. The Constitution gives the federal government the monopoly on charging excises, and so they had to do some snappy footwork where the federal government took over the charging of a fuel tax and then paid the revenue through to the states. Since Victoria has implemented its charge, 2 Victorian EV drivers have challenged the charge on the basis that it too is an excise, and that's currently in the High Court. So this could end up, changing substantially again. My suspicion is, if this challenge succeeds, which I think it might, we might have something similar. The federal government has made some statements along the line of it wants to work with the states on the pricing of EVs. So we may see a national charge in the way we have a national fuel tax in the future. So just a couple of thoughts about what the implications are of this sort of strategically. Obviously, all these governments decided they'd adopt a very simple, low-tech kind of program design, and that meant that they could implement it immediately if they want to, although only one of them, as it's turned out, has. that's reduced the risk of implementation failure, and it's avoided the privacy issues associated with a GPS-based system, which may or may not have arisen in a context where most motorists in Melbourne and Sydney have an electronic toll transponder device, which equally tells the government where they are at any given time. Obviously, the New Zealand charges is raising an equivalent amount of revenue to what its fuel tax does on petrol. Victoria's chosen to have a slightly lower level at the moment, but you would have to think that the likelihood is there that it will increase in the future. Questions of whether the current charge could be improved in terms of efficiency. Probably the variation in mass between different kinds of EVs doesn't make a great deal of difference to road damage costs. But on the other hand, there does seem to be some good evidence about that. The costs of accidents are significantly higher for heavier vehicles, which could potentially provide a sufficient reason for differentiating the charge according to the mass of the vehicles, perhaps having 2 or 3 mass-related bands and so forth. Obviously, a congestion element can't be added to the charge with the mechanism we have at the moment. Melbourne and Sydney are both crying out for congestion charges, so there's an issue there. But this seems to be a long way from political resolution in Australia, and I don't think politically the opportunity was there to use this sort of a charge for that purpose, even if it had been considered technologically feasible at the time. There's an obvious question as to whether embedding the principle of using distance-based charging is a step forward in that political sense and enables us to have the door open to a more sophisticated and differentiated charge being adopted in the future. I guess conversely, you could argue that perhaps the fact that there's one in place might create a sense of stasis, and it might be difficult to make, more difficult to make changes in the future. I made the comment about congestion charging. It's again a little bit difficult to see what this means for the future of congestion charging. I suspect not very much either way in the Australian context. It may be different in other places in Europe where congestion charging is more a possibility, and the issue of whether to go sooner with a simple undifferentiated distance-based charge like this, or wait and try and load in a congestion-based element would be the better option. But I think in Victoria and the rest of Australia, it was clear that going ahead was and embedding this idea of a distance-based charge was to be preferred. Okay, thanks.